Let's start with the IMF downgrading Australia's economic growth forecast this year to 1.7%. That's quite a bit than they thought it would be this year. How concerned are you about that? How much is this trade war? How much is it other things endemic to the Australian economy?
Well, clearly the trade tensions between the US and China have been a negative for global economic growth. They've seen an impact on trade volumes, they've seen an impact on capital flows, and it's led to a deferral of investment decisions. But what we do know is that the Australian economy continues to grow. Kathleen, we're in our 29th consecutive year of economic growth. The IMF is forecasting growth of 2.3% for 2020, so that's faster than G7 nations. Our labour market is strong. We've maintained our AAA credit rating. We've got a current account surplus. We've brought the budget back into balance. So on a lot of objective indicators, the Australian economy remains strong.
And yet, the Reserve Bank of Australia just cut its key rate to a record low of 0.75%. This was not on Governor Lowe's radar screen when he started the year, nor anyone's. Does this open the door to at least considering some more fiscal stimulus?
Well, the first thing to say is monetary policy is the remit of the Independent Reserve Bank of Australia. And you're right, interest rates are now down to a historic low. But I think that's fair to say across the world we've seen downward pressure on interest rates. So Australia is not alone in respect of a low cash rate. But in terms of fiscal policy, what we are rolling out is a $100 billion infrastructure program. We've also seen the states engage significantly in infrastructure spending. We passed tax cuts through the Parliament, which were the most significant in more than 2 decades. And just in recent months, more than $20 billion has made its way into the pockets of hard-working Australians as a refund for the 18-19 year. So there are initiatives, policies that are putting more money into the pockets of Australians, which is money that is being spent increasing economic activity.
And I know that you're in budget surplus territory, which is a very, it's quite an accomplishment for any country in this day and age. Is there a point then, if, let's say the downturn continues, because we don't know when the trade war is over, do we? And that uncertainty is hurting businesses again, including in Australia. Is there a point where the government considers using some of that hard-won surplus to just put a little more juice into the economy?
Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive, having a surplus and balanced budgets as well as having a strong economy where there is continuous economic activity. We're investing in infrastructure, we're providing tax cuts, and we're also looking at the supply side of the economy with competition reform, deregulation, industrial relations reform, and of course free trade agreements that we've entered into that's opened the door for Australian businesses to millions of new customers. So I think we can still deliver the surplus as promised, and indeed we're committed to that, as well as see the Australian economy continue its record run of growth.
Well, and I think that's a concern because this record run of growth is so important to your nation, to your consumers, to your businesses. RBA looks like it may have to keep cutting rates. If they cut rates enough, they're going to start buying bonds. They're going to enter into QE territory. I know it's their remit. However, broadly speaking, does the government feel that would be a good thing if that's eventually what has to happen? Are you on board with bond purchases by your central bank to boost the economy?
Well, you can only go on the words of the bank itself, and they have said in recent weeks that it's very unlikely that we'll see unconventional monetary policy. Now, you're right, the cash rate is low, but to go to the next step is not something that they have immediately flagged. What we do know is that the fundamentals of the Australian economy remain sound. While other major economies experienced negative growth in the June quarter, Australia continued to grow. We'll wait and see what the September results show, but by then we would have seen the benefit not only of the tax cuts, but also of the interest rate cuts. And of course, we've now had an election period, so that uncertainty in the marketplace is also over.
Let's move on to some of these trade issues, particularly to Australia, I should say. About to complete your ratification of a free trade agreement with Hong Kong. What will that do for the economy of Australia? At the same time, with all this, so much aroused by this these Hong Kong protests. I don't quite have the words for it. What does that mean then for the Australian government's position, I guess, on the protest? Everyone is being asked that question now. It's the lens through which everything seems to be looked at.
Well, we've been very concerned by the demonstrations, the response, what we've seen play out on the streets of Hong Kong. At the same time, we recognise that having a good trading relationship and economic relationship with Hong Kong is mutually beneficial. And we have, as a government, entered into new free trade agreements with a whole series of countries. As you know, we entered into one with China, one with Japan, one with Korea, the 11-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're working on a comprehensive strategic partnership which will include India, the ASEAN countries and also China. So when we came to government, only 26% of our two-way trading relationships were covered by free trade. Today that's over 70%, will go to 80% and above as a number of these other agreements that we're negotiating come into being.
So then it's important to look past the protests and what that might say about Australia's support of the protest, or do you think that's an unfair question?
We've been very outspoken on those issues, and we are deeply concerned by the images that we've seen on the streets of Hong Kong. In terms of our economic partnership with Hong Kong, that will continue.
I want to ask you also about the sort of the China-Australia relationship, because I think that there's also been some very pointed comments from the Prime Minister, for example. In a speech, he said China should be viewed as a developed, not developing nation. Others share that view. Your Home Affairs Minister said the Communist Party of China's, the Communist Party's policies are inconsistent with Australia's values. Again, this is something that potentially seems to put some tension, some friction. It is a very important relationship between Australia and China. What's your response?
Well, it's an absolutely critical relationship, and it's one where we have seen it go from strength to strength over the years. In fact, since we entered into that free trade agreement in 2015, Kathleen, we've seen a more than 40% increase in two-way trade. A third of our exports go to China, more than $200 billion in two-way trade last year. We're seeing a lot of Chinese students study in our education institutions. We've seen over 1 million tourists come to our country, and likewise we're providing the services, the agriculture, the resources that are critical to the growth of the middle class in China as it continues to industrialise. So the relationship is important. It's at a number of levels, and I think we can balance both some of the challenges we face globally and also obviously the US-China relationship with the importance of that two-way bilateral relationship.
I want to ask you about one more important relationship, US and Australia. President Trump seemed to have a very pleasant visit with Prime Minister Morrison. There's so much. Again, this is also a dynamic situation. In terms of Australia, in terms of where the president stands now, there's impeachment proceedings, there's all this swirling around him. What kind of position does put that in Australia in? That's what others have been talking to me about, wondering what you might say.
Well, I thought that the welcome that President Trump gave Prime Minister Morrison was really well received and greatly appreciated, and it was a reflection not only of the strong, productive relationship those two leaders have developed, but also the long-term relationship that our two countries have shared based on similar values and history. So that continues to be the case under President Trump, as it was under previous presidents, and it will be under future presidents and future prime ministers. So the relationship is between our two countries based on shared values, shared history, shared interests, and of course that will continue for many, many years to come, long after you and I are out of these respective roles.